There was a general feeling in Washington that the war effort was lacking, and some of the blame was pushed toward Jesse Jones, who was argued that the RSC wasn't lending fast enough.
The main issue was what the press called the national rubber emergency. A modern army runs on rubber, and with 97% of the world's supply in Japanese hands, the U.S. lacked the natural rubber it needed to fight the war.
Here are two simple rules for this rubber emergency. First, turn in all the old rubber anywhere and everywhere. Secondly, cut the use of your car.
Despite recycling efforts, a synthetic substitute was desperately needed. Jones RFC funded experimental synthetic rubber plants, but charges arose that he had spread himself too thin and the effort was moving too slowly. The Washington Post, owned by Eugene Meyer, a former RFC chairman, published a scathing editorial blasting Jones for delays in the program.
In this editorial, the program was being delayed by Jones' boundless ambition. Well, this upset him naturally. He was furious about it.
Meyer's stinging attack shattered Jones' normally even temper.
The next day, the two of them happened to be at a dinner at the Willard Hotel, and Jones came up to Meyer, and he was so furious, he grabbed him by the lapels and started shaking him.
The brawl was reported the next morning with great amusement. But there was nothing funny about the growing feud between Jones and Henry Wallace. He all but called Jesse Jones a traitor to the war effort, and Jones responded by calling Wallace a liar. The dispute soon spread beyond rubber, in part because Roosevelt put Wallace in charge of other parts of the war mobilization effort, guaranteeing that the two men would continue to battle not just over ideology, but over turf as well. With the battle spilling over into the press, hearings were launched to determine whether Jones had in fact delayed mobilization. The outcome vindicated Jones and his RFC, but it did little to dampen the feud between Wallace and Jones. President Roosevelt removed some of their duties to try to keep the peace. But the fallout from their feud didn't stop there. In 1944, when Roosevelt ran for his fourth term, the Democratic Party insisted he drop Henry Wallace as his running mate for the more moderate Harry Truman. To compensate Wallace, Roosevelt let him take his pick among several cabinet posts. Wallace chose the Commerce Department, which Jones had made into one of the most powerful positions in government. Jesse Jones was not told of the arrangement. He attended Roosevelt's fourth inauguration on a cold January day in 1945, standing beside the sickly president.
I, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, do solemnly swear.
It was a brief ceremony, and after attending the formal luncheon, the Secretary of Commerce returned to the hotel where he and Mary lived. The desk clerk handed Jones a letter from the White House. After 12 years of service to Franklin Roosevelt, the president had fired him and was replacing him with Henry Wallace.
The day after President Roosevelt fired him, Uncle Jess came here to his office across from the White House. He worked at this very desk to write his statement to the press. He had accomplished so much for the president, it just didn't seem right. When President Roosevelt offered him the chairmanship of the Federal Reserve, or just about anything else he wanted, Uncle Jess said no. But he wasn't one to brood. He got ready to return to Houston. But first, he made sure Henry Wallace wouldn't get his hands on the RFC.
Jesse Jones, retiring Secretary of Commerce, testifies before the Senate Commerce Committee on a resolution to divorce the RFC lending agency from the Department of Commerce. The nomination of Henry
Jones used his influence with Congress to make sure that even if Henry Wallace got his position, he wouldn't get the power.
The man who holds the vast responsibilities contained in the RFC should be one of proven and sound business experience.
The Senate did confirm Henry Wallace as Secretary of Commerce,
That the powers of the RFC
but took away
should be
the
exercised
RFC.
in such a way as to carry out the objectives.
Jesse Jones would be the first and last individual in American history to hold such enormous economic power. On their return to Houston, he and Mary settled into their apartment atop Jesse's Lamar Hotel, built on the site of his first lumber yard. And after the frenetic years in Washington, they enjoyed their extended family and granddaughter Audrey. He took back the reins of his business empire and continued to shape the city.
It was totally his skyline. I mean, you'd have to say that the buildings that stood up were the Jesse Jones buildings. And in those days, they weren't as tall as they are today, but they were the tallest we had. And they were all his. And it was certainly his stamp on this city. Very physically visual.
Accelerating a long practice of philanthropy, the Joneses established scholarships so that thousands could attend college, helping young people from all backgrounds get the best chance they could at a college education. But at the same time, Jesse Jones was turning away from the Democratic Party he had loyally served. Roosevelt went too far, he told a friend. With the emergency of the Depression and war over, Jones believed there was no longer a role for his RFC. It should be given a decent burial, he said. And in 1948, he began to vote for Republican presidential candidates. But he never renounced his conviction that government should not just participate, but should take an active hand in the economic affairs of the nation.
The importance of Jesse Jones and the RFC is to remind people that government is not the enemy. The government is one of the instrumentalities that free people have to improve economic conditions and economic opportunity.
When Jesse Jones died in 1956 at age 82, his funeral procession traveled a paved highway that had been a dirt road when he arrived in Houston more than half a century earlier. He was still Mr. Houston. He molded his community in a way few American cities have ever been shaped by one man. The vast fortune he'd taken such a delight in making, he left to a charitable foundation with directions it be used to nurture his adopted hometown. I suppose I'll be lucky to get to heaven, he'd once joked, but if I do, I'll be happier there if it's just a mite like Houston.